Midnight pressed against the world like a suffocating velvet, thick and wet with the rage of the storm. Rain hammered the ancient cobblestone streets, each droplet a tiny fist, bruising the surface of a village that huddled beneath centuries of secrets. The houses, their windows shuttered and warped, cowered in the wind's howl, but even their battered walls seemed to flinch as a car's headlights sliced through the gloom. The engine sputtered at the edge of the old portal, surrendering to the night, and the family inside, two parents, weary and raw, a sullen teenage boy, a wide-eyed little girl clutching a teddy bear, emerged into the onslaught. Lightning clawed across the sky, forking violently above the silhouette of the manor that loomed on the hill, its blackened bones rising from tangled roots and skeletal trees. The path to the manor was a gauntlet of shadows and brambles, muddy water pooling in ancient ruts. Each footstep squelched with a sickening, sucking sound, as if the earth itself wanted to drag them under. The little girl's shoes left perfect, fragile prints behind her, each one quickly blotted out by the rain. The boy, jaw clenched in defiance or fear, kept his gaze fixed on the dark windows above, as though expecting to see some ghastly face peering back. The parents spoke in clipped, anxious whispers, promises of warmth, of safety, of just waiting out the storm. Though their eyes flickered with the knowledge that the village's only inn had turned them away, its keeper's voice trembling as he pointed them toward the abandoned estate. The manor's doors groaned open, resisting as though they had forgotten the concept of welcome. Inside, the air was colder than the storm. It pressed close to the skin, worming its way through layers of clothing, settling deep into the bones. The flicker of a single candle did little to chase away the darkness. Instead, it seemed to give it shape, casting the furniture and warped wallpaper into a carousel of monstrous silhouettes. The walls, streaked with water stains and old, indecipherable symbols, seemed to pulse with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, as though the house itself was breathing. They moved from room to room, their footsteps echoing through hollow corridors, each echo sharper than the last. At every turn, something was not quite right. The chill that grew sharper near certain doorways. The way the wind outside fell silent whenever they passed beneath the arched ceilings. The lullabies that seemed to hum beneath the floorboards, just at the edge of hearing. The little girl froze, her fingers tightening around a teddy bear, as a nursery rhyme whispered from the depths of the manor, a melody both sweet and raw, each note bending with age and grief. The boy scowled at the shadows, daring them to move, but his bravado wilted whenever the storm's thunder rumbled and the candle guttered low. Outside, the skeletal trees clawed at the glass, their branches scraping a message in a language only the heart could fear. The parents tried to unpack what little they had, their hands trembling as they lit more candles, each new flame revealing another oddity. A child's shoe, decades old, tucked behind a cracked radiator. A locked door that rattled on its hinges when no one was near. The little girl traced a faded symbol on the wall, her breath fogging before her face. The boy found a broken toy in the corner, its eyes missing, its mouth carved into a silent scream. Midnight deepened, and with it, the sense that the house was not merely shelter, but a waiting mouth. The storm outside became a backdrop, a thin layer of reality, barely holding back something older, hungrier. The family huddled together as the wind rattled the window panes, but each was alone, drawn into their own silence, their own coil of fear. Whispers curled through the manor, slipping between the cracks, promising that nothing would be the same once morning came, if morning ever came at all. In the hush that followed the thunder, the line between what they imagined and what watched them for the darkness began to blur, and a single, chilling certainty settled into the marrow of the night. Something in the manor was listening. Even as the family settled into uneasy silence, the manor began to reveal its deeper strangeness in ways that defied simple explanation. The air seemed to press against their eardrums, not with the hush of abandonment, but with a charged, almost expectant tension. Every so often, a draft would swirl through the hallways, carrying with it a scent that was neither dust nor decay, but something sharper, reminiscent of wilted flowers and cold iron. The little girl's teddy bear, set on a faded armchair, will be found shifted ever so slightly with each pass through the parlor, as if it had responded to a whisper only it could hear. Meanwhile, the teenage boy attempted to distract himself with the fractured remains of a chess set abandoned on a side table. He discovered pawns engraved with strange, looping designs, each piece warm to the touch, as though they had just been handled. Rather than comfort, this familiarity left him unsettled. The pieces, when set upon the board, seemed to rearrange themselves in the blink of an eye, never quite matching the pattern he intended. Now, reflect on the disorientation when logic falters, when what you see and what you know part ways, leaving you at the mercy of inexplicable small changes that erode your trust in the world. Elsewhere, the mother, seeking reassurance in routine, tried to light the old stove in the kitchen. The matches fizzled out one after another, refusing to spark, as if the air itself was too damp or too stubborn to ignite. In the shadows beyond the kitchen door, she caught the faintest echo of someone humming, a child's voice, perhaps, rising and falling in a melody that sounded both foreign and achingly familiar. Flickering candlelight cast fleeting silhouettes along the walls, with one shadow always a beat out of sync, lagging behind the others, as if reluctant to join the present. This subtle discordance, where even the light cannot be trusted, invites you to question how much of your own perception is truly under your control. Moving upstairs, the father explored a narrow corridor lined with closed doors, each one marked by a different symbol carved deep into the wood. He ran his fingers over one, felt the grooves bite into his skin, and recoiled at a sudden chill that radiated not from the air, but from a memory the symbols seemed to conjure. A flash of a child's laughter, abruptly cut off, and a sense of being watched from behind. The corridor bent in impossible ways, sometimes seeming to stretch longer as he walked, other times closing in so tightly he could barely breathe. In spaces like these, where architecture itself seems to mutate, the very idea of sanctuary collapses. What comfort remains when the walls themselves become untrustworthy? As the night deepened, the ordinary sounds of the house, pipes creaking, wind moaning, gave way to a new, irregular rhythm. Doors clicked open an inch, then shut again before anyone could respond. The family's voices echoed oddly, doubling back in tones that didn't quite match their own. Beneath the floorboards, a faint scratching began, methodical and persistent, like fingernails dragging across within a pattern too deliberate to be random. Imagine, for a moment, the way your heart stutters when you realize you are not imagining these sounds, that the house is responding to your presence, molding itself around your fears and anxieties. Through these mounting disturbances, the boundary between self and environment thinned. The family's individual attempts to find solace, rituals of play, nourishment, exploration, were quietly subverted by the Manor's will. Each new anomaly chipped away at their sense of agency, transforming familiar acts into uneasy reminders of their helplessness. In such moments, you are forced to wonder, when every comfort warps into a threat, how long before you start to see the enemy in your own reflection? Gradually, the night's architecture began to bend perception in subtler, more insidious ways. The Manor's mirrors, ornate yet speckled with age, no longer reflected the family's movements with perfect fidelity. Instead, they seemed to capture gestures a moment too late, or caught glimpses of expressions, furtive, grief-stricken, fleeting, that no one recalled making. As the wind rose, it became difficult to distinguish the groan of timber from the hushed syllables of forgotten voices. The mother, drawn by an uncanny glimmer, approached a mirror at the end of the main hallway. Her own gaze peered back, but behind her, in the glass's cloudy depths, a procession of shadowy children walked single file, their forms wavering like candle flames. She blinked, and the vision dissolved, leaving only her own reflection, eyes wide with confusion and dread. Meanwhile, the teenage boy discovered a journal wedged between floorboards in a disused bedroom. The pages, stained with damp and written in a looping, frantic hand, chronicle the descent into despair. Cryptic warnings about the night's claim and repeated pleas to listen for the second lullaby. Now, imagine the creeping anxiety of deciphering a stranger's terror, knowing each word is a breadcrumb meant for someone else, yet feeling as if the message is addressed solely to you. The boy, compelled by curiosity and a rising sense of responsibility, read on, only to realize that the handwriting grew eerily similar to his own with each new entry. The last page was an unfinished scrawl, as if the author had been interrupted mid-thought. Elsewhere, the little girl, restless and uneasy, wandered into the servants' quarters, guided by a draft colder than the rest of the manor. Here, the air tasted of iron and mildew, and the silence was broken by the faintest sound, a melodic ticking, as if dozens of clocks had once lived and died in these walls. She followed the noise to a locked chest, its surface carved with the same cryptic symbols that marked the doors upstairs. Now picture the sense of forbidden invitation, how the unknown beckons with both threat and promise. Her hands trembled as she traced the carvings, and the ticking intensified, echoing in her ribcage. When she pressed her ear to the lid, a lullaby, warped and sorrowful, seeped through the wood, its words indistinct yet laden with warning. Meanwhile, the father, consumed by an urge to explore the cellar, descended the narrow staircase into darkness. There, the air grew thin, tinged with rot and the faint sweetness of overripe fruit. What he found was not the expected detritus of abandonment, but a series of handprints, small, muddy, and impossibly fresh, smudged across the stone walls and leading deeper in the shadow. Flicking his flashlight, he glimpsed fragments of children's drawings, a row of stick figures, some with heads missing, others with hollow circles for eyes. These crude illustrations, rendered in what looked like charcoal and dried mud, depicted scenes of games interrupted by looming, faceless shapes. Within this cramped, suffocating space, the past pressed close, demanding acknowledgement not as memory, but as living presence. Adding to the mounting strangeness, the family began to lose track of time. Their watches spun erratically, the hands jumping from hour to hour, while the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed at unpredictable intervals, each toll resonating through the floorboards like summons. The boundaries between waking and sleeping blurred. Dreams carried the scent of damp stone and echoed with the voices of children singing in languages no one recognized. Now, reflect on how the erosion of time's structure unmoors the mind, making every moment suspect, every recollection a potential invention. The family's attempts to anchor themselves, to record the hours, to recount the sequence of events, only deepened the uncertainty, as if the house itself fed on their confusion, thickening the night with each unanswered question. In these moments, the manor's influence became less a backdrop and more an act of force, orchestrating fear not through overt aggression, but by unraveling the fabric of certainty. Every object, every reflection, every sound carried the possibility of omen, and the family, tethered to one another by fraying threads, felt the weight of unseen eyes cataloging their every move. The sense of being watched was no longer suspicion, but a living, breathing certainty, and the question shifted from whether something lurked in the darkness to how long it had already been there, waiting. As the night unraveled, the manor began to assert itself not through tricks of perception, but by preying on the most intimate weaknesses of its inhabitants. The architecture itself started to mutate, hallways subtly altering their angles, corners stretching in unnatural arcs, so that rooms once familiar became labyrinthine traps. The boy, searching for the bathroom, found himself looping through the same sequence of doors, each one opening onto a room that looked almost, but not quite, like the one before. Portraits on the walls shifted as he passed, eyes following, expressions flickering between pity and accusation. A sense of being measured, tested, weighed for some unknown purpose settled over him. Rather than simply feeling lost, he experienced the acute disquiet of being led, as if the house anticipated every hesitation and mistake. In another wing, the mother became aware of a low, rhythmic thumping, a heartbeat embedded within the walls. The pulse grew stronger the closer she drew to the grand staircase, and with each step, she fought the urge to synchronize her breathing to its tempo. The compulsion was subtle but insistent, a physiological manipulation that blurred the line between the body's needs and the will of the house. Now, think about the disquiet that arises when your own biology is no longer sanctuary, but a channel for outside influence. She found herself gripping the banister, knuckles white, unable to move until the thumping abated. The realization that her own body could betray her deepened the terror, instilling a primal distrust of her senses. Meanwhile, the father stumbled upon a hidden alcove behind a false panel in the library. Here, ancient ledgers cataloged names and dates, meticulously recorded in a hand that grew more erratic as the years progressed. Each entry chronicled a child's arrival and a subsequent erasure, a careful balancing act of presence and absence. What struck him most was not the content itself, but the deliberate omission. Poor lines scratched out so violently that the paper tore, as if the memory of certain children had been forcibly removed from history. This deliberate erasure called into question the integrity of memory itself. If the past could be rewritten at will, what assurance remained that any recollection, joyous or traumatic, was ever authentic? The father's own childhood recollections flickered uncertainly, destabilized by the possibility that memory was just another room in the manor, subject to rearrangement and decay. Elsewhere, the little girl followed an unspoken summons, a trail of tiny, frostbitten footprints leading toward a narrow servant staircase. The air here was thick with the scent of bold lavender and mothballs, but beneath it lurked a sharper tang, metallic and cold. Each step downward sapped her warmth, as if the house siphoned not just heat but hope, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. Descending further, she encountered a corridor lined with dolls, each one meticulously arranged and dressed in faded finery. Their glass eyes glistened in the candlelight, but none faced forward. Instead, every doll gazed into the darkness at the end of the hall, necks craned, mouths stitched shut with red thread. The tableau was not merely decorative, but a silent ritual, an offering perhaps to whatever dwelled in the shadows beyond. It was in these moments of solitary exploration that the family's individual vulnerabilities became conduits for the male's aggression. The boy's stubbornness became a trap, compelling him to push further into the shifting maze. The mother's empathy rendered her acutely sensitive to the house's manipulations, her emotions twisting into knots of dread. The father's rationalism crumbled in the face of evidence that logic could not contain. The little girl's innocence left her most susceptible to the house's subtle invitations. Each found themselves isolated by their own fears, unable to articulate the full extent of their experiences for fear of sounding mad, or, more chillingly, for fear that the others would understand all too well. Taken together, these encounters revealed the house as a malleable entity, one that did not simply exist but actively shaped itself to exploit its guests' secret shames and unspoken desires. The line between external threat and internal weakness blurred, leaving the family caught between fighting the house and battling the darkness within themselves. In such a place, even the act of reaching for comfort, whether in a memory, a familiar object, or another person, risked awakening a new facet of the terror, for the manor seemed to feed on every attempt at solace, twisting it into a fresh source of dread. In the suffocating stillness that followed each revelation, the manor's hunger for suffering sharpened. The storm's violence outside waned, yet the true tempest raged within, manifesting in the family's most desperate moments. Notably, the air thickened with a cold that could not be explained by mere weather, a chill that seemed to seep from the very stones, threading along veins of ancient malice. This coldness did not simply numb the skin but seeped deeper, suffusing marrow and memory alike. so that each inhalation tasted of ice and old sorrow, rather than a mere environmental discomfort. This biting cold served as a silent interrogator, exposing vulnerabilities with every shiver. Against this backdrop, the family's connections frayed in unexpected ways. The mother, for instance, began hearing her children's voices echo in rooms where they had never set foot. Their laughter warped into a brutal mockery of joy. She followed these echoes down unfamiliar corridors, each step accompanied by an oppressive sense that she was being led somewhere she was not meant to go. As she advanced, the voices shifted, blending with distant lullabies and the faint creak of a rocking chair. At times, these sounds crescendoed into a cacophony so overwhelming that she pressed her hands over her ears, only to discover the noise persisted, not from without, but from within. This internalization of terror forced her to question whether the house was amplifying her fears, or if her own mind had become the ultimate betrayer. Elsewhere, the father encountered a different kind of dread, a series of cryptic messages, each carved in frost upon the window panes, spelling out names and dates that sent a bolt of recognition through his core. Some names belonged to distant relatives, others to figures he could not place but felt he ought to remember. The frost refused to melt despite the warmth of his breath, etching itself deeper with every attempt to wipe it away. In a sense, these messages served as reminders that history, no matter how deeply buried, will claw its way to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. The father's growing conviction that he bore some indirect responsibility for the house's legacy gnawed at him, manifesting as guilt that twisted his every decision. Simultaneously, the teenage boy became preoccupied with a series of recurring dreams, each more vivid than the last. In these visions, he navigated a maze of hallways lined with portraits that wept streams of black oil. At the center, he always found a locked door with a key made of bone. Each time he reached for it, a voice whispered from behind the door, offering salvation in exchange for a secret he had never spoken aloud. When he awoke, the sense of having betrayed himself lingered, staining his waking hours with an inescapable shame. Such nocturnal bargaining blurred the line between dream and waking, inviting the possibility that the house's influence extended even into the sanctity of sleep. The youngest child, growing more withdrawn, clung to her teddy bear as if it were a lifeline. Yet, even this comfort was not immune to the house's touch. The bear's button eyes began to cloud over, and its once soft fur grew coarse and stiff. She confided in the shadows, whispering her fears to unseen listeners, convinced they could offer her protection. One night, she discovered a trail of muddy footprints leading from a bedside to a small, previously unnoticed door. Rather than feeling fear, curiosity took hold, and she followed, unaware that each step marked a deeper descent into the house's grasp. Her absence, when discovered, would catalyze a frantic search, one fraught with the dread that love itself had become a vulnerability, a weakness to be exploited by forces neither human nor kind. Throughout, the Manor's tactics evolved, exploiting the unique weaknesses of each guest. The cold, the whispers, the spectral messages, and the insidious dreams all conspired to erode not just hope, but the very sense of self. In such an environment, you might discover that your own mind is the most dangerous labyrinth of all, every memory a potential trap, every bond a possible snare. Beyond the threshold of panic, as the family's search deepened, the Manor revealed its most insidious dimensions, not through overt terror, but by conjuring impossible paradoxes that gnawed at the bedrock of reality. For instance, as the father frantically threw open a door in pursuit of his missing daughter, he found himself staring not into another room, but into a grove of trees impossibly lush, their branches laden with fruit that glimmered with frost. The air inside this hidden space shimmered with a faint blue glow, each breath thick with the scent of unfamiliar blossoms. Yet, when he reached to touch a low-hanging branch, his hand passed through it as if the tree were smoke, leaving a brief sting of cold that lingered even as the vision dissolved. Here, The house blurred the line between memory and hallucination, forcing him to question whether he glimpsed a fragment of someone else's past or a vision meant solely for his torment. Moving through the manor's core, the mother encountered a staircase that spiraled downward in a way that defied all sense of geometry. As she descended, the walls pressed closer, the air grew heavier, and yet the steps continued, unfurling endlessly with no bottom in sight. Her own footsteps began to echo in a dissonant rhythm, as if someone, or something, descended just behind her, always out of sight. Each landing was marked by a different artifact. A thimble, a cracked teacup, a child's mitten, all arranged with care as offerings or markers for those who'd come before. The further she went, the more she felt her own sense of time slip, minutes stretching into hours, hours collapsing into moments. This temporal distortion left her reeling, unable to trust even the most fundamental truths of her experience. Imagine now the vertigo of losing your grip, not just on space, but on the very sequence of your life. The anxiety that every step might erase a piece of who you are, or worse, override it with someone else's sorrow. Meanwhile, the teenage boy found himself drawn to a series of windows overlooking a courtyard that could not possibly exist within a manor's architecture. The scene beyond was washed in a perpetual twilight, with children playing a game of Ring Around the Rosie, their faces obscured by veils of mist. At the center of their circle stood an old, rusted birdcage, inside which a flickering candle guttered in a wind that didn't touch the leaves. When he pressed his palm to the glass, the children froze mid-turn, their heads snapping up in eerie unison, and the courtyard itself seemed to lean closer, as if inviting him to join. The terror here was not of violence, but of invitation, an implicit promise that crossing the boundary would mean surrendering his place in the waking world for good. Such moments forced him to grapple with the possibility that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. Elsewhere, a clock on the landing began to tick backward, its hands crawling in reverse as the chimes rang in minor keys. With each toll, the shadows in the hallway thickened, coalescing into forms that mimicked the family's own movements with grotesque exaggeration. One shadow knelt and cradled something invisible. Another traced words onto the wall that vanished before they could be read. The mother, watching these silent performances, realized with mounting dread that the shadows anticipated her reactions, flinching when she recoiled, drawing near when she stood her ground. This blurring of agency, where one's own actions became both cause and effect, eroded the distinction between actor and observer, leaving her with the queasy certainty that she was not simply being haunted, but rehearsed. In the deepest passageways, the little girl's trail of muddy footprints began to branch, splitting into paths that led in opposing directions, each marked with a different symbol drawn in a wet, quivering hand. The symbols pulsed with a faint light, throbbing in time with the thunder outside. For those who followed, the choice between paths became less a matter of logic and more an act of faith, a gamble in which every option promised a different flavor of loss. In that moment, all pretense of control vanished, replaced by the cruel realization that the house offered no solutions, only riddles, each more corrosive than the last. The terror now lay not in confrontation, but in the slow, gnawing awareness that the only way out was through choices that could never be undone. Reflecting on this journey so far, one cannot help but sense that the manor has become more than a setting. It is a living labyrinth, its boundaries shaped by the shifting tides of fear, longing, and fractured memory. The storm outside, once the most immediate threat, now serves only as a dim echo of the turbulence raging within these walls. Here, the familiar has been rendered unrecognizable, as if every echo and shadow conspires to reshape the world according to rules that flicker and dissolve the moment you try to grasp them. In such a place, time itself seems to ripple, pooling in corners or rushing ahead, leaving those within to navigate not by logic, but by a kind of trembling intuition, a gut-deep sense that something essential is always just out of sight. This environment, charged with a peculiar electricity, draws out the invisible lines connecting each soul under its roof. Every choice, hesitation, and silent plea reverberates as though the house itself is a great, hollow instrument tuned to human frailty. The air grows thicker with possibility and regret, the past and present entwining in ways that refuse simple separation. In this suspended state, where the usual markers of comfort and certainty have been swept away, there emerges a profound vulnerability, a rawness that both invites and resists transformation. The house's influence, like a dark tide, does not simply sweep the unwary along. It seeps into the cracks of intention, eroding the boundaries between self and other, between what is endured and what is chosen. As these unseen currents swirl, there arises a peculiar sense of anticipation, as if the manor is holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. The family, each battered by uniquely personal currents of dread, finds themselves orbiting a shared gravity, drawn together not by clarity, but by the undeniable pull of the unknown. The doors that once hinted at escape now seem to promise only further descent, and the passageways, rather than offering routes to safety, spiral deeper toward a center that resists all illumination. In this gathering darkness, the residue of every unspoken fear, every secret longing, gathers mass and momentum, threatening to unmoor the very foundations of identity. The very fabric of reality seems to thin, its threads stretched taut by the weight of so many unanswered questions and half-blinched truths. Each breath is a wager, each heartbeat a measure of how much can be endured before something essential gives way. Yet even as the night presses in, there persists a flicker of something unnameable, a hope, perhaps, or simply a refusal to yield completely to the void. This tension, the sense of standing on the threshold between annihilation and revelation, infuses every moment with a charged expectancy. In light of these insights, the path forward grows increasingly fraught, illuminated not by certainty, but by the cold fire of necessity. The house, with its shifting architecture and relentless intrusions, has not merely tested the boundaries of fear. It has revealed the porousness of those boundaries, the ease with which safety can collapse into exposure. And so, as the Quatayans grind inexorably toward the appointed hour, the stage is set for a confrontation that promises not only terror, but the possibility, however slight, of something beyond it. As we pivot toward the final reflection, allow yourself to linger in this liminal space, where every shadow contains both threat and invitation, and every silence vibrates with the promise of reckoning. As dawn's first pale suggestion pressed against the grime-streaked windows, the storm's fury faded to a hush, leaving the manor in a silence fit with the residue of everything that had transpired. In this hush, the survivors, changed, fractured, but still breathing, moved with a caution born not of hope, but of the deep knowledge that some wounds persist long after the thunder has passed. The house itself seemed to settle, its walls relaxing as if sated, yet in the air lingered a chill that no returning warmth could dispel. Each corner, each shadowed passage, held the memory of what had been confronted: loss, terror, the dissolution of certainty, yet also something quieter, more insidious. The recognition that within the heart of every nightmare lies the echo of a wish, a longing for meaning even in the face of ruin. As the family emerged into the fragile light, the world beyond the manor felt altered, the village's ancient stones now bearing silent witness to the ordeal. What had been endured beneath that roof was not simply the machination of some external malice, but an intimate dialogue between fear and love, between the desperate urge to protect and the painful necessity of letting go. The night had demanded choices of them, choices that revealed the porousness of their own boundaries, the ease with which certainty yields to doubt when tested by the unknown. In the end, what lingered was not the memory of a single monstrous presence, but the understanding that terror, at its core, is a reflection, a darkened mirror held up to the face of all that is cherished, all that might be lost. Yet in the terrible aftermath, there flickered a strange kind of grace. The realization that to endure horror is not merely to survive, but to be forced relentlessly to reckon with what matters most. The house had stripped them bare, exposing every secret, every hidden grief, every fracture in the bonds that held them together. It had offered no easy answers, only the relentless demand to choose between clinging to illusion or facing the raw, inescapable truth of their own vulnerability. And in that crucible, something essential was revealed, the capacity to carry on, not in spite of fear, but alongside it, woven into the fabric of what it means to be human. As the day slowly reclaimed the world from the grip of night, the family's ordeal became a memory, then a story, a warning, perhaps, or a prayer. The manor stood unchanged, its windows dark and inscrutable. Yet in the minds of those who had crossed its threshold, it remained a living reminder that the boundaries between reality and nightmare, between comfort and terror, are far more fragile than we allow ourselves to believe. The true terror, they discovered, was not in the shadows themselves, but in the ways those shadows exposed the shapes of our own hearts. How easily love can tip into obsession, how quickly hope can curdle into dread. So, as you close the door on this particular darkness, do not mistake silence for safety, nor daylight for certainty. The echoes of what was faced within those walls will ring on, long after the storm has passed, shaping the contours of every choice, every whispered reassurance in the night. The line between courage and horror is never clean, and sometimes in the quiet that follows is the questions left unanswered, the footprints that vanish, the lullabies that persist, that become the truest inheritance. The true practice begins now, to walk forward without flinching, to let the memory of what you have faced sharpen your gaze, and to remember that even as you step into the light, the shadows walk with you, waiting to be understood.